Seuraava puhuja meillä on Ingmar Björkman Svenska Handelshögskolanista ja hän tulee kertomaan meille ihmisten johtamista Kiinassa. Ole hyvä.
Okay, kiitoksia. I will, however, make this presentation in English, and I'll start out by explaining partly why and also say a few words about my own background so as to put me on the map and hopefully also make you understand why I was asked to come here today. I'm originally Norwegian, got a PhD some 20 years ago. I've done most of my work over the last 10-15 years here in Finland, being a professor at Hanken School of Economics, but also a visiting professor at INSEAD in France, working on issues, teaching on issues, doing research on issues related to management of people or human resource management within multinational corporations. However, the more direct linkage to the seminar today is the fact that since the early 90s I have been working with firms, done research on, and taught in China quite extensively. The whole thing started out when I, in 1991-92, was a visiting professor at Hong Kong University, and then spent 2 months in China, traveling around by hard seat on trains, by local buses, visiting joint ventures, and of course back then virtually all the foreign investments were joint ventures. So I visited a large number of provinces and spoke to expatriate managers about their experiences in managing these joint ventures. And back then the interest of mine in issues related to management of people emerged. It was fun, it was interesting, I learned a lot. And I've kept on trying to understand what goes on in China, going back there a few times every year. However, very quickly it became slightly frustrating because whenever I think I had learned something, understood something, it struck me that it may not be applicable in the particular situation I now find myself in, or in the company I'm visiting, or the people I speak to. So what I, over the time, learned was that the saying of an old CIA agent, John Frankenstein, tells a lot about China. What he told me some almost 20 years ago was that his summary of learning after having studied China from Hong Kong and also on the mainland was that everything you hear about China may be true, but nothing is reliable. So whenever there is someone who tells you that this is China, this is how things are in China, this person is not to be believed, I would argue. But rather, to the extent that these people are able to point to important questions to ask and are able to reflect on specific issues that you come across in your dealings in China, these people are in my view, trustworthy and worthwhile to use as consultants and discussion partners. And of course, you should then use the same caveat when listening to me. Hopefully there's something in what I'm going to say, but don't take it too literally. So what have I been asked to talk about? I've been asked to talk about culture, and I will do so in the context of management of people, of course, given my background, my experience. So the cultural part will be a fairly general one, and I'll try to link that to people management issues. Why is this important, I would argue? Well, if you ask top managers of foreign firms in China today, in surveys, or you speak to them, most of the time they will put people issues as their most significant challenge. It's not corruption, it's not infrastructure problems, it's not distribution, it's people management. So the two questions I'll pose and try to answer somehow is how to work with local employees, and secondly, what bit more structurally to do in terms of the management of people, looking at recruitment, selection, performance management, compensation, retention, which is a big issue, and then localization of management, which is certainly high on the agenda for most firms in China. So first, how to work with local employees. My starting point for talking about that will be surveys that have been done, studies that have been done, and also my own experience in meeting with people, expatriate managers in China, and asking them what they think of the people they work with. And here the focus is really on professionals and managers rather than workers. Here is a summary of some of the, you could call, complaints that they are presenting. First of all, what many people talk about is lack of initiatives, lack of feedback, and lack of problem recognition of their local employees. What this really means is that when you add the lack of responsibility taken to this, is that the role played by expatriate managers in China tends to be more extensive, broader, and the expectations on expats to know what to do, to make decisions, and to be able to follow up the extent to which these decisions make sense is broader, as I already said, than what we used to in Finland or in Scandinavia or the US, most Western settings. Third point that you quite often hear is that local employees don't communicate straight. They are vague. They are vague in terms of what they think we should be doing or what they should be doing in terms of planning, and so on. Fourthly, quite many expats complain that local employees don't do what they have agreed to do. So they believe that there is an agreement on certain things, but nothing seems to be happening, or it seems to be happening more slowly than they would have expected. Fifth, lack of communication, especially across units. Within a unit, there are extensive networks, extensive communication, but what very many firms, and this includes also Japanese firms, are complaining about is that it's difficult to get cross-functional teams or cross-business unit teams to function, and it's also extremely difficult to get matrix organizations to function, i.e. having two bosses to whom a certain person reports. Then, more specifically HRM related, local employees tend to ask for or expect rapid career development, pay increases, and little commitment, i.e. people tend not to be committed to staying in the firm, but rather jump from one firm to another all too easily, according to many expats. And then finally, there is also some lack of basic competence on the part of employees. Okay, and if this is the case, and this is, I would argue, based on my experience, what I've read and so on, fairly commonly held views on the part of foreign managers in China, obviously we should ask ourselves, well, firstly, is this true? There might be a myth, a stereotype created among expats. But secondly, if there is some basis for it, why is that the case? And that's what I'll try to do in a minute. But before I do so, let me just try to balance a bit, that you also get lots of comments about people being hardworking, lots of people being extremely intelligent, smart, lots of people working in foreign firms being extremely eager to learn. So it's not only black, it is more balanced in reality. But nonetheless, why do we seem to get these kind of lists? How can we make sense of these complaints? And what I'm going to ask, and that's partly also related to the fact that I was asked to talk about culture, is that to what extent might this be an outcome of certain cultural features? that we find in China. And when trying to answer this question, I'll go to sort of the basics of cross-cultural studies and our understanding of cross-cultural differences across societies. And if we want to understand differences between, let's say, the Chinese society, the Finnish society, the Swedish society, the French society, and so on, what we might want to do is to pose certain basic questions about what makes a society work. There are certain general questions that you can pose, like you see here on the slide. What is the relation to authority in society? To what extent is a society, you call it democratic, horizontal versus vertical? What is the basic conception of self? Is it the individual? Is it the group? And what kind of group in that case? What determines societal order? Is it rules? Is it rule by law that Michael here was pointing to? Or is it something else, like relationships? What determines status? And then finally, what's important? What are the kinds of claims that people make to argue for why an organization, why a society, why an individual should do something? So if we want to then try to answer these questions in the context of China, and of course compare China to other societies, other cultures, most observers, most scholars would say that we have to go deep into history. We have to look for the cultural roots, and most would go back to good old Confucius, who lived some 2,500 years ago, and for whom a basic question was how to create a society, a Chinese society that would be harmonious. He lived during times of internal war, civil war was going on, so he tried to come up with a notion of the ideal society, or at least a society that would work. And one of the things that he did was to specify that in society there are 5 cardinal basic relationships. It's prince-minister, so the emperor and people working in government kind of relationships. It's father and son, it's husband and wife, older brothers, older younger brother, and friend. And what those of you who look at these relationships perhaps notice is that at least 4 out of 5 of these are hierarchical. So basically what Confucius did was to create a hierarchical structure in society, an ideal hierarchical structure in society, that then people over the next 2,000 years, up till roughly 100 years ago, internalized as the way in which the empires worked in China was that those working for the government had to read, had to understand, and had to internalize Confucius' writing. So basically, you can say that those persons governing China had these writings and these ideas in the back of their heads. So obviously, what it means, if we believe that this is still influencing organizations and the Chinese society, is that it's a hierarchical society. It's important who is above, who is below, who is the boss, and who is the subordinate. And everything we know about China academically, but also in terms of practice, indicates that it is a fairly hierarchical society. There are certain rules that bind superiors, and there are certain rules, norms in society that influence how subordinates are supposed to behave. They are supposed to pay respect, they are supposed to be obedient, they are not supposed to criticize, they are not supposed to point to problems or deficiencies in what their superiors are doing, and so on and so on. And obviously here there's a linkage back to the slide I had on the challenges or the problems that Western managers have often found in the context of China. At the same time, there are also certain expectations on you as a superior. You are supposed to protect and be considerate and take care of those below you. Again, something that goes beyond what we tend to find in the Finnish society. So if the superior doesn't do this, it means breaking the norms, breaking the expectations towards you. Okay, so hierarchy is the first dimension and certainly one of the most important ones. In cross-cultural psychology, they are playing all kinds of games and doing all kinds of tests, and this is a fairly famous one, asking people in different parts of the world, what do you see here on the screen? Fish. Okay, you see a fish. That's the fisherman. Okay, in the US society, what do you think you see? You see a leader, a charismatic leader who's getting followers through his or her behavior. In the Indian society, you see a number of fish trying to overtake the first one. That's a typical response in the Indian context. In China, what do you see? You see followers. You see people who look to the leader for what they are to do. Just an illustration of the fact that in the Chinese context, hierarchical, don't go beyond the leader, don't blow the whistle if something is wrong. Second point, ascribed versus achieved. Traditionally, in the Chinese context, it's ascribed, i.e., it's the age, the authority, the family you come from, rather than the innovativeness or the performance that matters. Males here, females here. To me, one of the implications of this is that there is in China, like in many other societies, if not most societies, everything else equal, better to hire women than men. Because if they systematically are being undervalued in terms of perceptions about their competence, it means that from a value maximizing point of view, you can get them at a cheaper price and they will work better, harder for you than men. And I would argue that this is the case, and I would argue that firms that do well in China, and if you speak to experienced people in China, they tend to favor women above men. Groups versus individuals, this is no-brainer. I'm sure that if I would have asked you, everybody would have said that China is more group-oriented society or collectivist society than Finland. However, what I think is important to point out here is that societies differ in terms of the kinds of groups that they ascribe to. So while in Japan, the notion of a group is much broader, in China it's much more narrow. It's the family, it's the group of friends, it's possibly the group of friends that has emerged through education and so on. But it's not the organization as a whole. So the commitment that exists within a group is not to the organization as a whole, which partly explains what I earlier showed about the lack of commitment to the organization in the Chinese context, and for instance, to Japanese businessmen, this has been a huge surprise in the context of China. So also pointing to the fact that it's extremely dangerous to draw Asian cultures and argue that they are similar. It's like if we were now in California and we would have a seminar on doing business in Europe, and we will lump together Finns and a Greek, talking about European culture. Okay, what are some of the implications of this? Well, what is in-group and what is out-group makes a difference. It's important in groups to retain harmony. If there are conflicts, there's pressure to bow to the interest of the group, and if there are severe conflicts, you bring in mediators, the well-respected third person who help things out. Externally, there's a law of the jungle. So you can have escalation of conflicts, you can have open fist fights, and there's very little generalized trust in the Chinese society. Extremely little. And that matters in terms of how the society works. Can you trust laws and regulations? I would argue that most Chinese are very far away from trusting the legal system. Yes, there might be codified rules and laws in China, but their implementation is patchy at the best and not trusted by people within the society. Okay, guanxi, I'm sure that many, if not all of you, have heard the term, and I won't spend very much time on this, but just point out that still today, most would argue that China is a relationship society, a society where relationships matters. If things go wrong, it's because you didn't have the right relationships. If somebody goes to jail for corruption, it doesn't mean that this person necessarily is more corrupt than another person, but it means that his or her relationships were not strong enough to back this person up. And obviously, this has a huge number of human resource management implications. For instance, just a no-brainer, whom to recruit. To what extent does this person have relationships that are favorable for you in the context of what you're doing? To what extent has, for instance, this person gone to the university and the educational system in China is, and I'll come back to this later on, extremely extensive. So what really matters is if you have gone to the right universities, which allows you to have built the relationships that matter in a certain industry, which then becomes an important selection criteria. While at the same time also realizing that it's to some extent doubtful that you will be able to draw 100% on the relationships of people in the organization. And that has to do with the point I'm making here about balance. Every time you use your relationships to get a favor, you create an imbalance in the relationship. If I help you out a number of times, it means that the other person, or if I help person B out a number of times, person B has every possibility to come back to me and ask for extremely extensive favors. So it is a question to what extent you can actually draw upon the guanxi of people in your organization. Okay, not more about this, and also partly because I know that you have touched upon cultural issues, partly because I know that in later presentations today you will return to this, and just to check my notes, especially Jukka Kyttälä will actually come back to talk about a number of the things that I'm mentioning in my presentation. Face, again, everybody, I think, with some experience has read something about China and Asian societies in general will understand the importance of this. In a sense, you could say that your face is your claim to status in society. So the higher claim you have yourself to status, the bigger loss of face you might experience if people don't give you the face that you claim for yourself. So the higher people up in society, the better they should be treated, the more attention they should get, the more important it is not to show that you think that they don't know, are stupid, and so on and so on. And here I actually think that Finns have a comparative advantage in China. I think Finns tend to do better in this respect than the typical American guy who comes in and brags about himself, presents how much he has done, how much he understands. In the Chinese context, if you want to play by local cultural norms, to the best of my understanding, you should play yourself down, and you should play the other person up. So my wife is ugly. No. My wife is even uglier. My house is nothing. My apartment is small. The food is horrible. No, it's very good, and so on. So at least traditionally in the Chinese context, I think this is the way to go about this. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow, traditionally, lessons are from history. What the old emperors did, what happened in the Civil War 2,500 years ago, are still being used as arguments today, or have at least up to very recently. And You shouldn't go beyond that. So, those of you who have listened and have not fallen asleep might have asked this extremely relevant question. Do you buy this? Is it really so that Confucius' teachings and the kind of message you tend to get in books about Chinese culture, they tend to reflect, I would argue, quite a lot of what I said. Is that really valid today? And what about differences within society? Yes, I agree totally, and this is my understanding of the situation today. On the one hand, yes, we do have traditional values. We do have 3,000 years of history, or 2,500 years since Confucius. At the same time, there are competing value systems in China. We have the 30-year parentheses of a communist rule that I don't think we need to talk much about. But certainly, during the period between 1949 and the late 70s, these were the kinds of issues that were pushed in Chinese society, and they are still, to some extent, influencing people who grew up and internalized this period. But more and more what we find, I would argue, is a set of emerging values. Values that are much more sort of Western in many respects, materialist values, less hierarchical, towards rule of law, although, as I said, I don't think we're there yet in general, and certainly not in the thoughts of people in society. Much more achievement-oriented people today than or some people today. The entrepreneur, rather than the scholar or the farmer, is now the big hero. Extremely many people in Chinese context dream about starting their own firm. Yes, we'll work for a foreign multinational for some years, but then go on to start our own company. Current-oriented and much more direct communication. So obviously, this means that things are not simple. Things are not simple in terms of where the people that you have to deal with are in terms of these value systems. As a general rule of thumb, I guess, the young generation is further down here. Well-educated people with experience from leading universities, who have done an MBA, who have worked for a multinational corporation, and so on, are much more done here. And certain regions are much more down here. So what I'm really saying is that it's extremely dangerous to generalize when we talk about culture. We talk about values, we talk about behavioral norms on the part of the Chinese because of this variance. But generally speaking, these two value systems are still around, and I think it's equally dangerous to downplay the role of history in shaping people's values and norms as it is to downplay the changes that are happening in terms of emerging values. Okay, so what do you do? What can you do then if you go back to the initial question, the initial list of challenges or problems? Here is my modest list of things. Build relationships. Clarify responsibilities and objectives, more so than you would elsewhere. So it means, to some extent, at least initially, much more micromanagement than what you would do in Finland or in Sweden or in the US. Follow up, again, more micromanagement, more top-down, but at the same time trying to use that as a context for learning yourself what happened and why. So what could we have done better? So mutual learning, trying to use that here. Work initially mainly face-to-face rather than big groups in terms of feedback, in terms of trying to get a good discussion going, using meetings more in the Chinese way for information initially, and making sure that things are being communicated, and then only gradually to use meetings in a more sort of decision-oriented way. In traditional Chinese organizations, Meetings are occasions where the boss tells people what to do. They are not occasions to discuss openly, to reflect on issues, and so on. Possibly invest in training. Large multinationals, the IBMs, the Nokias of this world, they actually run assertiveness training for their local employees, trying to sort of teach them the expectations, trying to teach them how to act, and also build into the performance appraisal, performance management system, the extent to which people provide feedback, the extent to which people are making proposals, and so on. So you're following it up and evaluating people based on that, and it might also be linked then to rewards. And then finally, give development opportunities, and I think most of the things you have here on the slide are fairly clear, but of course there are also drawbacks, there are of course also question marks related to this. If you invest too heavily, too fast upfront in training and development, obviously you increase the market value of the people who are then more likely to leave you for better offers elsewhere. So the point is to build it into a more progressive, more long-term strategy of employee development. I'm not saying that this is simple, but at least for the time being, this is what I understand of this issue. Okay, very quickly, the second question, and just a couple or a few points related to that. Obviously, I already touched upon some of the more formalized HRM practices that one could imagine implementing. At the general level, this, I think, is the way to think about it. To what extent does it make sense to bring to China and to try to implement practices that have been successful elsewhere? And to me, the starting point is not what is the context to which we must adapt, but rather what makes us successful elsewhere, and then asking ourselves critically, or learning even, the extent to which you must adapt those practices. If you try to play the Chinese game, if you try to put in place HRM practices that are similar to those in Chinese firms, you're unlikely to be successful. They're likely to be more successful at doing that, plus it is likely to be an integrated part of how you operate, and that has made you a successful player elsewhere in the world. Nonetheless, obviously there are cultural factors, institutional factors that you have to look at, but at the same time, I think one should be open for the fact that even though there might be cultural differences in general in society, there is this variance. So the way in which you manage people, the kind of HRM practices that you have, might fit a certain part of the population, and that's possibly the part that you should be going for, rather than trying to adapt your practices. How to attract people? This is a tricky one, especially for small firms. If you don't have any brand recognition in the labor market, how can you stand out? Again, to some extent, I think you can stand out by doing things slightly differently. To some extent, you may need to adapt slightly to the local context. This is a list I got from the HR director of a large Nordic multinational in China, how they trying to do it. What are they trying to adapt to, or how have they adapted what they call the employee value proposition to the Chinese context? In China, they do certain things differently from elsewhere. They have an employee referral program that they don't run elsewhere, i.e. they pay bonuses to people who suggest persons who are hired by the firm. They focus more on competitive pay in the Chinese context. This company is not a good payer elsewhere, but in Chinese context, they have to be one step ahead, have to be doing better in terms of paying people because of the competition for talent. They have to focus more on coaching and mentoring than they do elsewhere, and so on. So again, the global way in which you do it as a basis, and then asking yourself critically, what do we need to adapt? a question one often gets is, well, what kind of compensation system do we need to put in place? If compensation is so important, what should we do? Well, what we see in China is, especially when it comes to this, quite significant shift over the years. Today, especially people with higher education, those that you have in managerial professional positions, expect and accept that performance is linked to pay. And the bonuses that we tend to have in the context of China are higher than we tend to have them here. If people are paid more or less the same, or get the same bonuses, that's a surprise. I remember once I was working for a large Finnish telecom company in China, and the firm had done extremely well and paid out the bonus to everyone. And several of the local employees were really furious. Why? Because everybody got the same. They had contributed much more than the person at the frontier desk, or the person that is answering the phone. There are some challenges. There's a red eye disease, which means that everybody tends to know what everybody else gets and tends to be jealous. Guanxi face and so on, I don't think we need to say more about that, which leads to, again, certain adaptations in terms of how you do this in the context of China. Those are the 3 points I made down there. Finally, the economics of HRM, demand and supply matters in China. Demand, well, if you have foreign direct investments going up like they've done over the last 20 years, obviously there's a demand for people who do well. And then the question is, well, what is the supply of people? Competent local managerial staff in extremely high demand, and their salaries, and that's the bad news, is approaching that of expatriates. So the salary development of local employees who do well, managers, general managers, and so on, has been extremely swift. Professionals, there we see a rapid increase in graduates, and this is one of the questions I got for today. So I managed to find on the net late last night some data on the number of people accepted into college and universities in China, where they have actually, there has been a 500%, more than 500% increase in the last 10 years, which means that today there are lots of graduates, but the quality of these is poor. So this is the result of a McKinsey study on how many of the graduates do you think actually has the competences needed, asking HR managers and professionals. And in the Chinese context, we had 10% of the engineers and 15% of the finance and accounting majors, and then 3% of the generalists. So yes, there are many people out there, many graduates, but the quality varies tremendously from the top universities, which actually are really good and have extremely smart, hardworking people, much better than you would find here. Teaching people in China, I actually find the quality is better than teaching people here at the top 5 universities in China. But that is not the case if you go to the countryside, to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th tier. Finally, retention, huge issue. Many of the things you would do elsewhere, you can do in China. There are certain things that are different, and what I will do is to provide you with a copy of the slides, so I don't want to go through this here. Let me just, at the end, as I'm running out of time, point to 2 additional sources of information that might be of interest to you. First of all, if you have a general interest in international HR issues, with a couple of, one INSEAD and one IMD colleague, we're just coming out with a book in a couple of months on that topic. If you're interested in management issues in the context of China, this is my favorite. Very easy to read book, which is based on interviews with CEOs of Western firms in China. Fernandez and Underwood's China CEO, that covers a range of issues, including management of people, HRM, but goes beyond that. With that, thanks a lot. And I'm between you and coffee, which I guess means that the questions will be 0. Thanks.
Right, thank you, Ingmar. I have to say that you gave us so much to digest that it takes a couple of days to really understand what we heard. But really, lots of thanks, and I have to say that this was a good lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. By the way, feel free to copy and steal my slides. I think that's a part of the reason why I get paid by the Finnish government.
Thank you. Thank you. Meillä on nyt kahvitauko, mutta ennen kahvitaukoa pieni mainos tässä. Eli meillä on tuolla aulassa odottamassa tämmöinen kirja, klassikko, Sodankäynnin taito, jossa tämä on varmaan aika monelle tuttu, mutta tämä on hyvä johtamistaidon kirja. Olkoon se teille tästä tilaisuudesta pieni muisto ja muistutus. Kannattaa perehtyä tähän kirjaan. Siinä osataan perusteellisesti yksinkertaista asioita, ja tässä nähdään kiinalaisen kulttuurin vahva tausta. Nyt mennään kahville, tullaan takaisin 20 yli. Jatketaan silloin näillä tosielämän tarinoilla.